Good afternoon. My name is Donna Brooks, and I am the Interim Director and Program Manager of the Digital Scholarship and Publishing Studio at UI Libraries. It is my pleasure to moderate our second panel, Digital Pedagogy, Expanding Digital Literacy and Creativity in the Classroom. The focus of this afternoon's panel discussion is demonstrating 4 academic uses of Fortepan Iowa, a photo history platform which features photographs of Iowa everyday life gathered from family albums, newspaper archives, and small museums. Fortepan Iowa launched in 2015 at the University of Northern Iowa with 2,000 photographs. Today, there are more than 26,000 high-resolution photos with nearly 8,000 tags, all searchable via Google image search. This platform has become an increasingly valuable tool for academic research and pedagogy. I'm honored to introduce our panelists who will share 4 ways academics can use this public platform's features for research, visualization, and classroom instruction. First up, Dr. Bettina Fabos, Director of the Fortepan US Cooperative, Photo History Portal, and its prototype, Fortepan Iowa. Both projects display curated family snapshots and historical photographs from the 19th and 20th centuries. Through her work, Dr. Fabos has initiated the development of new archival platform tools for digital storytelling, geolocation, and research. Dr. Fabos, Professor Emeritus in Interactive Digital Studies at the University of Northern Iowa, will share the newest Fortepan Iowa platform features.
Thank you. I appreciate that introduction because you're touching upon some of the most important parts of the archive. It's curated. It's about family photos. It tells a different story from the bottom up of Iowa history, and we're interested in those marginal stories, the stories of everyday life, the stories of women, the stories of people who don't get into the seats of power. I'm just having it kind of go on autoplay in the background just for a minute as I just say that the curation really matters because if we put up every photo that we ended up scanning, it would become a boring space. And one of our real key goals is to create a beautiful space, an energizing space, a space that you want to keep on exploring with your name? Donna, I'm sorry. When Donna mentioned 8,000 tags, we have 8,000 more, I think now, 8,000 tags, all these different ways to explore the archive from piano, from baby. I mean, just think about all the tags that can be assigned to any one of these photographs. And then another thing, besides the fact that we're really interested in meaningful photographs, we look for images that are really associated with a sense of place. We're really interested in people finding images that are relevant to them. And wouldn't you know, people are really interested in where they're from and where they've been and places that matter to them. And so really place, time, and theme is the way that the whole archive is organized. And that is not the way archivists in general think. Archivists think about historical preservation most of the time, and they think about provenance and historical order. We are really geared towards everyday users, and so we're all about user experience and engagement, user engagement. So our images come from family photo albums, a lot of them. We also have quite large newspaper collections. This is a really, really incredible collection that we're in the process of handling right now of Coon Rapids. We have about 10,000, 12,000 photos that we are processing from Coon Rapids, and it is really exciting. You will see a little presentation on how this collection, this huge collection, is being interpreted through the lens of gender by 2 graduate students from the University of Northern Iowa. But it is sometimes boring photographs, but they really connect to place, and we're really putting Coon Rapids, tiny little town of 1,200, about half an hour west of Des Moines, kind of on the map as a microcosm of Iowa everyday life. So we have an interface that is, let me get out of Coon Rapids here. we are based on time. We have an interactive timeline here. We have a grid view and a timeline view. So if we are interested in, let's just type in piano. This is the chronology of all the pianos that we have in the archive itself. So everything is immediately lent to telling stories. So when things are organized by time and place and theme, and when you can drill down certain themes and start telling stories just based on the juxtaposition of those images, it becomes a very powerful storytelling tool just by exploring a certain theme. So we scan every photo at high resolution. Every image is released to the Creative Commons with a CC BY SA license. Every image is downloadable for thorough public use. We have artists wheat pasting photos on buildings. We have people who are using these images for calendars, for book covers. It's really exciting. They're using in the classroom, and teachers love it because they don't have to ask permission to use the images. So it's all part of the archive. We also have built in tools for interpretation, which you'll see a really good example of. But in the back end, we have a mapping interface that is kind of unfinished right now. We're waiting for some funding to get it to be the way we like it. So that's happening. We have a photo story in the back end. You can build photo stories by adding content blocks and adding photos from those content blocks and building stories. So a really easy, user-friendly story tool that's built right into the platform that draws on any image that you want to. And you'll see a beautiful example of a photo story in just a minute. And then we have another project that was, wouldn't you know, it was an NEH project, and it was terminated last March by a certain administration that cited that NEH projects were not worth funding. So this is unfinished, but it's a really cool exploratory street view, historical street view, kind of like a Google Street View with historical images that are superimposed on top of the original place. And the last thing I'd say is Fortepan. It's kind of a weird name. Why is it called Fortepan? And I wanted to show you that it's named after this Hungarian film that came to be in the 1940s, the late 1940s, and became like a pretty important and global brand of film among Hungarians all over Europe. And if you know photographers who were active in the 70s and 80s, 90s, the film brand was defunct by 2001. A lot of the pictures in these archives are from Fortepan film, and the Fortepan project in Hungary is just this unbelievable project that is sort of our namesake, and we're partners with them, and we are working now on building connections and sharing our code, and then finally uniting the Fortepan in US, which is the first sister site, and the Fortepan now Europe, Fortepan Germany, Fortepan Switzerland, Fortepan Albania, Fortepan Kosovo. We're growing, and it's really cool to see how this project is resonating for lots of people. We are going to see now how it's used as a tool for academic interpretation. So, your guys.
Next, I'd like to welcome Paige Hibbs and Tara Wilson Pickering, both graduate students in Women and Gender Studies at the University of Northern Iowa. They will co-present ways they're using Fortepan, Iowa to examine rural Midwest life through the academic lens of gender. Paige Hibbs is a graduate student. Her current research focuses on women's collective organizing in the 19th century, particularly within women's voluntary and social organizations. Her broader scholarly interests include feminist theory and LGBTQ history, with an emphasis on historical construction of sexuality and community.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Paige Hibbs, and this is Tara Wilson Pickering. And today we're going to show you a little project that we've been working on. We are graduate students from the Women's and Gender Studies program at UNI, and we have been working along with Bettina and Fortepan to kind of delve deeper into what Fortepan could be academically. And we'll also be showing off the photo story tool that is so great. So our project was to analyze these everyday Iowa photographs in the lens of gender. And this archive has just so much life and beauty and light because these photos are not staged for a particular purpose or anything like that. So we are working with the Coon Rapids collection. That's something that has come in very recently. It's a very big and recent project. And like Bettina said, there are thousands of photos that we went through. So we had a lot to work with. And all of these photos are from the Coon Rapids archive. So we're also looking at small town Iowa, not Iowa as a whole. Because it would be different if we looked at Des Moines or whatever. And basically, we found that gender norms appear subtly across spaces like work, home, school, and the public. And specifically with this photo, let me scroll up. There we go. Something that we discovered while we were hunting through all of these photos and coming up with a list of tags to organize them and make it easier to search, that there were very few men holding babies. I think there was only about like 5.
Yeah,
like it was very few, and here was one of them. And so this kind of told us and explained to us the expectations of who does the work in the home and who takes up space, and about general parenting and behavior norms. And also, this woman right here, like, she's not holding the baby, and he is. So it also kind of highlights that maybe this person took the picture because it was a father or grandfather or something.
Her hands are full, you see.
Yes, her hands are full. It was a woman's responsibility to be a caretaker. And yes. So we used a 3-tag method to organize these photos. Obviously, like, you could add so many tags to these, but for the purpose of this project, we did one physical tag that kind of identified like what you see in the photo, like clothes or objects or like the setting or something, and then one social tag, like the roles or patterns, like domestic labor, care work, that kind of thing, and then a theory tag to go along with it and wrap it up. Which we draw on from women's and gender studies concepts that we'll explain in a second. And so an example would be like care work, gender performance, and male gaze. And all of these photos have what we tagged it with using this 3-tag system. This is the full tag list. So obviously it could be so much bigger, but this is what we came up with and what we drew from. And they are separated into their respective groups. All of them?
Oh, go for it.
So for physical tags, we have gender expression, gender ambiguity, care work, gendered labor, feminine dress, gendered separation, gendered contact. And then for social tags, we have gender sphere, domesticity, heteronormativity, women's experiences, gender nonconformity, embodied motherhood, family roles, public versus private space, and gender hierarchy. And then for theory tags, we have gender performativity, male gaze, respectability politics, agency, and embodiment. And this was a really good exercise for us as we're going through our own degree and learning about these theoretical concepts, to be able to kind of flex those muscles and apply it to something physical. And then, So yeah, the power of a tag across multiple images, it can really be seen in Fortepan, and you showed it very briefly, Bettina, with just the large grid of when you look up a tag and everything kind of chronologically shows up. And it really connects the story together. Like this example down here, just to make it easier, I put 3 photos that have all the same domesticity tag. You looked up domesticity like Bettina did in the search box. So many more come up, but these are 3 that do. And they can tell you a story of women with women as a group collective, building community with care and doing laundry or there's just a lot of joy involved as well. So yeah, that is one thing we noticed. And then, so we use feminist theory as a lens. What do we see? We see feminist theory at work in Iowa. And we used 2 theories to anchor this project. One is Judith Butler's theory of gender performativity, which states that gender is performed and not natural through the way we have our mannerisms, the way we dress, and every day is a choice to perform that. And the other is through the gendered spheres framework, which signifies women as in the private sphere and men in the public or outside sphere. And yeah, I think I hand it over to you, Tara.
All right. Okay, where are we at on our slides?
Yes, I will do this.
Okay. So one thing that really surprised us as we explored these photos is that gender in everyday Iowa life wasn't always as rigid as we might assume. As you see here, Iowans were gender nonconforming, even in Coon Rapids. So we see a group of people dressed in exaggerated gendered costumes. One appears to be a man wearing styled clothing traditionally associated with women, but everyone's smiling and clearly performing for the camera. Moments like this suggest that gender presentation could sometimes be playful or experimental. Even in small town settings, people participated in performances or social gatherings. A lot of times we would see these in like auxiliary gatherings or like in the basements of churches where the women are having talks and coffee. So like they might be in just every ordinary situation, but having a good time. All right, wanna flip me there? Okay, so now we're looking at a photograph of a community swimming area in Coon Rapids, and it offers a good example of how gender expectations become visible through physical space and posture. So if you look closely, the men and the boys are mostly gathered near the water or actively swimming. And meanwhile, the women and the girls are grouped together along the building and shoreline. We don't know who's taking the picture though. So the separation isn't enforced, but it shows how gender norms were embodied in everyday life. So like who feels comfortable in the water, who's watching from the sideline, how many people position their bodies in the public space, reflect expectations of masculinity and femininity. So gender isn't just something people say or wear, it's something people physically act in space through body language. Thank you. So another theme we noticed throughout the archive is what scholars called respectability politics. The idea that people are expected to present themselves in ways that align socially approved behavior. So in this one, we have a group of women holding young children. The scene spotlights domestic motherhood and caregiving as central parts of the women's social identity. So women are positioned as the nurturers and caretakers, and this photograph reinforces that expectation visually with the women's warm smiles. So on the right, we see a staged interior scene where men are gathered around 3 well-dressed women. This kind of composition often reflects what historians describe as the male gaze, where the photograph frames women in ways that emphasize femininity, caregiving, or domestic roles. But these photos also show something else. They show how people participated in those expectations. So families were posed carefully, a young woman was dressed formally, but both presented themselves as respectable. All right. here's a good example of a woman speaking in a church basement. So this example highlights agency, something extremely important to our feminist studies. So in this photograph, we see an older woman. She's standing and speaking to an audience of both men and women. Her posture and position draw attention. She's the focal point of the room, and everyone else is oriented toward her and listening carefully. She embodies agency with her confident posture and her mannerisms. So, do we have another one? Okay. So I mean, in the former one, women, the communities were also participating in public life, speaking, organizing, sharing knowledge. Even though the social expectations existed, we still saw women participating in positions of authority. So this is our last one. So what this project shows is that the mundane can be incredibly revealing. I'd love to know whose grandpas these are. By applying our tagging system in Fortepan, we're able to ask new questions of these images and see a new side of the small town Iowa. So something as simple as a group photo, swimming hole, or community gathering can tell us a lot about how people understood gender in their community. And yeah, that's, I think.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Tara. Tara is a first-year graduate student in the Women's and Gender Studies program at the University of Northern Iowa, currently interested in exploring zines through an intersectional lens, passionate about supporting local art. She serves as the vice chair of the Cedar Falls Public Art Committee. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Kevin Mason, assistant professor of history at the University of Northern Iowa. Dr. Mason is a rural and environmental historian of the American Midwest, specializing in how human interaction with natural and built environments shape societies over time. His work blends rigorous academic scholarship with public engagement, aiming to make history accessible through both traditional and innovative formats. Dr. Mason will explore how integrating Fortepan, Iowa into an undergraduate public history course can anchor a sustained collaborative campus history project.
I feel like I should have put rural and environmental historian trained at Iowa State when they stood. No. Thank you for being here this afternoon. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I implemented this into my lowest level public history class at UNI. So there are a lot of different approaches. Those of you that teach understand you can come up with all sorts of different ways to approach getting students practical skills they need. And I think we've seen that throughout the day today. A lot of really interesting projects that people are working on at a lot of different institutions. And I think a lot of the projects we've seen are things that I want them to get initial exposures to as they move through a very basic course. So one of the first things, I was new at UNI this year. Fortepan was new to our hallway, and by coincidence, we're across from each other. And Bettina's created a very interesting project that lends itself to students getting very hands-on experience, and also, I think at a more important level, experiencing community. One of the things I love about Fortepan that's not going to show up in any of these presentations unless I think we voice it is that this is a home for so many people within our program and across our campus that are able to come and feel a sense of community and join with each other, gaining practical skills, working on the past. And that's one of the things that, like, all of this other really cool stuff aside, I love about Fortepan is that it creates an opportunity for that. So in my public history class, this year it's our 150th birthday at the University of Northern Iowa, and I always want to have a big theme for students to work on. So over the course of our 16-week semester, they're each going to choose a subset project within a bigger theme. So one of the first things I want them to understand is that partnerships are really important in any kind of work you are doing, and you need to be a good partner. So we do that in lots of different ways. So our two major partners in this semester were the 150th Committee at the university, as well as our Cedar Falls Historic Preservation Commission. Now, we also had subsidiary partners, of which Fortepan was one. And so to do that, Bettina came in and introduced the project to our students very early in the semester, talked to them about what the project could offer, made a pretty good pitch for interning at Fortepan for those students that were maybe more interested in getting some really hands-on practical skills. And then it maybe kind of went to the background as they started to work on other parts of their projects. So with our 150th, one of the things that we knew was we were going to have to create some kind of physical end products. One of the things I think theory is great, and we could talk about all the theoretical things, and like I want to challenge you for a second to think back to any undergraduate class you took, especially those of you that are far removed from that, and think about a theoretical concept you learned in an undergraduate classroom that you're still like, that was the day. Good luck. Maybe you had that experience. You probably, whatever. I think when students can take things and make them real through physical experience, it makes a difference. And Fortepan is a very good opportunity to do that. And we try to go through this class, and I'm not that smart. I went to an IO community college. I eventually went on and got my PhD, and I think about like I still approach things the most practical way possible in that, you know, I want my students to come out going, oh, I did that once. I tried that once. So we look at our projects throughout the day. Like earlier this morning, like Bamsi's talking to us about connections between different partners and physical spaces. One of the ways our students are going to do that is they have a connection with the Historic Preservation Commission of Cedar Falls. We gave interpretive tours in physical space across campus during homecoming in a way that they were all terrified of. It was so like, you guys ever do scary stuff? Like these undergrads were... for weeks in this class. They had all picked a building. I guess I should point that out. How we organized this was they went through and they drafted buildings on campus. They could pick any building, and one guy picked a pond, but that actually is no longer extant, which was also a heck of a choice, but I kind of baited him into it, and then he took it and started a campaign to bring back Prexy's Pond, including a kiddie pool that he sat in one day outside the business. It's a whole thing. But... I digress. So they each had a building on campus, and that was the first step. They picked them out. They were able to choose and have some optionality in that. And so we're anchoring it in physical space and then thinking about how we're going to interpret that, both for modern audiences and in a historical context. So one way to do that is, like Kevin talked to us about digital mapping. And if you have GIS skills, incredible, right? ArcGIS is a software that's expensive, as you talked about this morning. Even QGIS is going to take a learning curve, and unless you even have time for like a short course, it's going to be a really big challenge. But taking that and moving some of that kind of digital interpretation of a physical space, I think is a really good thing for students to get exposure of. There are opportunities to do that with Fortepan, and we try to create other opportunities for students to do that. Also, just thinking about like, Caitlin and Allison talking about just open source, community-led, end-to-end things like PubPub, and getting opportunities to do that. Again, if a student can get that experience in a lower level class and start to understand like what opportunities are out there, they have a good opportunity to kind of like take it and surprise you. And I'm going somewhere with this, don't worry. And then thinking about the critical cataloging aspects that June was talking about this morning is like, at the end of the day, we can have all of these big ideas about what we want students to do in this digital space. We can give them a building and tell them to interpret it. But there are also all these skills checkboxes that I want them to get. So when they come and they intern or they enroll in a graduate program, and they can go like, okay, I've done that once before, and here's something I can talk about passionately in an interview. So what does this look like in this class? They come in and we have Bettina visit us, and they start to put together different small things. So we start actually with archival research. We partner with our university archives and museum. They go in, and for many of the students, it's their first meaningful archival experience during their college career. And so they're going through, they're getting that physical experience with documents and objects, and starting to really pull things into almost kind of like an arsenal that they can deploy in all of these later projects that we're going to develop throughout the semester. As they come out of that kind of research phase, they start to write in different ways. I often joke with people that all I learned at Iowa State University was how to write boring stuff nobody wants to read. No, I'm joking. People like to read my stuff. No. Sometimes I do wonder, though, when we think about, like, as a historian, we think about academic history, sometimes we still operate in our discipline in ways that, like, are very similar to how our discipline worked when there was still a, like, functioning card catalog in this building, right? And I think that if we're continuing to operate like that, we're doing a disservice to our students. And we have to be critically thinking about how we can create skills for the modern workforce instead of bemoaning where we're at and, history, nobody wants to. People love history. It's the second most important tourism industry in the United States. It's one of the biggest publishing imprints in the United States. And we've just yielded that ground to other people, but I will step off the stump before I really get going about we should be doing things and we should be practicing these skills, because I am very confident that the things that historians do, and I could be wrong, I'm not even that good at one, but we do research from novel sources. We have to do that at an incredible level of depth. We have to analyze those sources efficiently, and we need to be able to communicate that clearly. And I think we're failing a lot of times that last part, and that's where digital scholarship can make a huge difference for us. And so one of the things I challenge students, they've gathered all these documents together, then they're going to start telling stories differently, and they don't believe me at the beginning that it's if you're writing a story about Prexy's Pond that no longer exists, that's a pretty short story. They filled it in to build the business building. Or if you're talking about Gilchrist, you're the first one burned down, then they built a new one, and then the second one burned down, and they built a third one, and it's there. And as you start to think about kind of these stories, it's really easy to write these simple stories that challenge students to start writing about things differently. So I even have them write the weirdest historical fiction that you can imagine during this early kind of unit. Then once we kind of come out of this writing part where they've written, they start with the most boring standard academic treatment, history if they're building. They move towards writing about it for a general audience in a different type of short form. They move into doing it in a historical fiction form. And then we start to make other stuff. And at every phase of this process, I try to give them as much autonomy and kind of optionality as possible, because those of you that are going to, whether you're in the workforce now or you're somebody that's going to enter the workforce someday, you have to make a lot of the decisions about what you're going to make. One of the things that I've seen throughout this day, and a lot of the people that are doing really interesting work, whether that's in our museum folks, it's people working in the public history sector or historians, are people making choices to make really cool stuff that people care about. But it takes that initiative. So one of the things that that's a skill I think you gain by putting yourself out there. And so I try to go, well, you have your building now. Now we need to make something digital. And this is where Fortepan came into this class. I think there are other ways we'll collaborate with this in the future. We saw a photo story that Paige and Tara were talking about, and that was a very popular option because we have several students that were going through. When I think about putting together a photo story, we're checking some of those practical skill boxes. They can go in and scan photos. I had a student that was in my office yesterday that he was over at Fortepan, and then he just came over to talk for a while, and I was asking what he was doing. He's like, well, I'm digitizing photos. And then he's talking about aspect ratios, and he's talking about things that I know he didn't know about before he walked through that door across the hall and started to do it there. There's also the pieces of this that go into tags. Thinking about the limits on tags is really important. What are important things? And that plays beyond, we think about it in this community as in our museums. I think about it also in SEO. Are you going to tag things correctly in ways that are going to allow you to get found out of search engines? That's a transferable skill that I think passes between these different things, and you can get to students to start thinking about that. I also love the photo story tool because it forces students to determine patterns. So one of my students that had this, and I could have thrown it up there, I guess, some of them didn't choose photo stories because their buildings aren't in Fortepan yet. Some of them then now are scheming, which I love because that class ended and they're still thinking about it. How many classes do you think about after they end that you took ever? A few. And I'll take that as a win if that's all they get out of it. But they went, and I have one guy who's now interning at the archive on campus this semester. He's like, I got a bunch of photos that need to make it into Fortepan for my building. Because he couldn't make a photo story. He made a website instead because that's that optionality. I went here's a different set of skills you do. And turns out it's easier to make a website than it ever has been before. And it's going to look really bad, but your next one will probably be better. And that's also an important lesson for students to get in these lower level courses where it's you know what, we all suck at stuff. And maybe we get a little bit better and a little bit better, and maybe we don't, but maybe we enjoy that. I don't know. There's something to that as well. So I had several of them, though, that made photo stories. They started to create really interesting subtopics because also they were getting bored. They were studying a building for 16 weeks. My favorite one in this was a student that I have. She's a non-traditional student that came from a community college. She was choosing to study our science building, which didn't have a lot of photos. It's one of the newer buildings on campus, and she decided to develop a sub-story about animals at UNI. Because today we have Allie the alligator. That's a little alligator that lives in McCollum Hall. She's going to find it. And she took that and she then pulled it backwards, and she ended up collaborating with one of her classmates. They came into my office, nervous. Hey, she's doing the botanical center. I'm doing the science building. They've both had alligators. Can we work together on this? Yeah, let's make stuff. They also they pulled in some other animals that they were able to find on campus. We have 2 parrots, some of these other things, and I'm lost in the weeds here, but there's an important piece of it of I started to see what happens in real time when people work on actual projects. And like this photo actually showed up in that photo story, and in the interpretation they provided with it, it's like, now we have a really small alligator. It's like the saddest thing. They put it in the, it was in the newspaper, and President Nook was there with this small alligator, like walking it down the hallway. And I was like, oh, they should put up the photo of like the full size alligator we used to have that was just hanging out on campus when people didn't have rules for things. And that was one of the, and that's not a direct quote, but it's a paraphrase of what that caption was on that photo story as she put it together. And determining those patterns, developing sub-themes, and then being able to incorporate some of those elements into other things. Because what we do towards the end of that class, we came out of, they'd done some digitization, they made some really bad podcasts, they had made some video elements that turned into now they're bugging me because they're all moving vertical, and they're all just making series of TikToks or other weird things, which is fine because I want better history TikToks than exist now. And then they were able to pull these things into their final projects. That's where the open licensing piece is so important with Fortepan. They had developed these collections of things. And then I saw them show up in some of the themes that they developed. And I think using this photo story forces them to focus on that didactic labeling level and then tying it together to create interpretations. And I saw that pull into others. So they were able to do whatever they wanted to do with that. So some of them created monument proposals. One of them read an HRDP grant for the state of Iowa. Yeah, I got it. In that was using themes that developed out of their Fortepan photo story about Bender Hall, taking some of those images that are in Fortepan and talking about those experiences about a building that's about to no longer be extant on our campus, or providing other types of interpretation and thinking about where this could go. One of them made side-by-side interpretation in multiple languages using some of these photos. I haven't even shown you this yet. It's super cool. In a website format, but it's using some of these images. I've talked through my time, which is totally normal. If you got questions about this stuff, ask him. Or Brian's going to talk about how he uses this in his Iowa history class. And if you don't ask me a question later, just shoot me an email. I love talking about weird stuff and collaborating. Thanks for listening. Introduce Brian.
Yes. And last but not least, we welcome Dr. Brian Rumsey. He teaches history and sustainability at the University of Northern Iowa. His history teaching includes courses on United States history, the history of Iowa, and environmental history. His research interests include floods and flood policy and perennial agriculture. He received his doctorate from the University of Kansas and also holds degrees from Iowa State and Mississippi State. Dr. Rumsey will share how he is using Fortepan, Iowa to connect his students' own personal family histories to the history of Iowa.
Thank you, Donna. Well, really good to be here, and like Kevin, good to be back at my alma mater. Good to be back in Parks Library for the first time in a while. So I, like Donna mentioned, I'm here to tell you in particular about the work that I've been doing in my History of Iowa class. And so we've really just kind of gotten underway with this project and collaboration with Fortepan, Iowa. So I don't have a whole lot of experience to share about yet, so I'll share a bit more about my aspirations for the class and kind of ways I'm thinking about framing it, as well as some of what we have done so far. But I can give you the basic idea of what we're doing in the class is that I am actually asking students to go and collect photos from their family or from their friends that could be candidate photos for upload to Fortepan. And so they've just done that. I sent them home with that task over spring break, a good opportunity when a lot of them will be at home or at least have some time to work on a project like this. So they were tasked to speak to family or friends who might be willing to share photos. Obviously can't require this, since some of them are from out of state, or some of them may have families who just aren't into opening up their photo holdings to the public domain, or just didn't have a lot of photos. But anyhow, so they were assigned to at least do the search. And they had to report the search to me, whether or not they came up with anything. And there's ways that they can proceed on the assignment if they didn't come up with any of their own photos to contribute. But a lot of them have come up with photos. I've been pretty pleased with that. The majority of the class, by my estimation, will be bringing photos to contribute to the class. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing how that develops. I haven't put eyes on those photos yet. I have read through their reports. We've had some conversations just coming out of break about how their searches went and the types of photos that they've found. And so a couple things I would say as far as contextualizing what I see this doing for us. So as Kevin mentioned, people love history, right? Like it's a passion subject or a hobby for a lot of people. But how does popular interest in history play out? Well, one of the ways that it really plays out is genealogy. Like, people want to learn about their family history. Genealogy often doesn't really connect that closely to the way that academics study history. How can we find an intersection? Well, I think that we have a great opportunity with Fortepan, because what we're doing, in the context of my class is, I'm sending students out. They're looking for family photos in many cases, or friends' photos, bringing those back in to upload, to analyze. And so what are we doing? We're not just building family trees, which of course has its own value. I'm not going to knock that. But what we're doing here is we're doing a kind of family history that can actually be informed by academic history, by giving us the chance to think about, what are the themes we're seeing, what's going on in family history. And so I'll speak in a moment to some of the photos that my students have told me about, and some of the ways that we can dig into those a little bit more than simply thinking about, well, this is grandpa and this is great grandma and things like this. So I'm pretty excited about this. I'm excited about building skills. I've been surprised over my time, as an instructor at the college level, how many college students really lack, basic digital literacy beyond the ability to scroll on a device. And I'm not speaking just specific to my history students, but more generally. So I see this as a great opportunity to build some digital literacy, and also build an introduction to public history. So Kevin's doing our public history course. But we got to have a gate. We've got to get those students interested in public history somehow. And there's a variety of ways that can happen. But one of the things that I hope happens with using Fortepan in the history of Iowa class is that students will have the chance to think about, well, this is really interesting. This is history that we can do. We can take our family's history or other local history and present it in a way that the public can access and can think about. And so maybe that's a seed that's planted, and maybe I send students on to Kevin's class, or they run with the idea of public history. And so the students in the class, there are history majors, but you don't have to take public history, so we got to introduce them somehow. Then you also have students in the history of Iowa class who are not history majors, but who just took the class because they're interested in Iowa history. And so this is hopefully going to be a gateway in a variety of ways. So like I said, this is my first time integrating Fortepan into this class, and so I'm having a lot of thoughts about how we might build upon this moving into the future. One of the challenges that I found the students ran into as they went home is, some of them talked to their families, and their family just maybe wasn't quite on board with the idea of making their family photos publicly accessible. So a vision I have moving ahead is that if we can actually integrate Fortepan into the class earlier on, and the students build some level of expertise and enthusiasm, they're going to be going home, they're going to be telling their families about the project from a perspective of excitement and much more engagement and knowledge, and really be able to sell the project in a way that they couldn't this first time around. So I can imagine a really productive implementation of Fortepan into the class, even as we start the semester kind of building our basic understanding of Iowa history. I mean, you look at what the photos held in Fortepan, you can go all the way back at least to the beginning of the 20th century, if not before, and connect those to things we're talking about more broadly in the course. So those are some ideas that I have. Looking ahead, I'm thinking that there's easily ways that this sort of thing could be done productively even beyond a History of Iowa course. So, for instance, almost every semester I'm also teaching a U.S. survey course, like the basic U.S. history that a lot of freshmen take across the university. So even at that point, I can see this being a great gateway into connecting local history, personal histories, connecting that with scholarly analysis, hopefully drawing students in, whether to the field or to public history, things like that. So I'm really excited about the possibilities. My apologies to Paige, who has taken both the survey and the Iowa history class with me back in her undergraduate days, but didn't get to do Fortepan in either of those classes. So I wish that we had those implemented at that time, but excited about what's going to happen in the future. So I'll close by just speaking to a few of the sorts of things that my students have found and some of the conversations that we've been able to have about those. So some of them are just kind of interesting, dives into family history, that conversations that they might not have had otherwise. I had one student report with enthusiasm that he learned that his grandfather had been a race car driver. That was something that he did not know before this project. I had another student telling me about how they learned that their grandfather and numerous siblings in a large family used to love to pretend to be gangsters, and they saw hilarious pictures of that. So, I mean, these are the sorts of photos that are great additions to Fortepan, that show we call punctum, this sense of piercing the viewer. But then we have photos that really allow us to dig into some of the things we talk about in a course like History of Iowa. For instance, I have a student who found photos of his grandparents' house during construction, and then different phases of additions. And so that led to a really interesting conversation about, well, when was this happening? So houses built in, I think, the early 1950s. So that ties into the post-war boom that happens in Iowa. And then when do additions happen? Well, you can tie that into periods of economic prosperity in the state. Also opened up some interesting conversations about suburbanization, like how does the urban and suburban landscape evolve over time. So that was a really neat conversation that came out of one photo. We had another student who spoke to photos that he found of his family's century farm. So that opens up interesting conversations about, well, century farms are not actually that common. What does that tie into in terms of what have been the trends of agricultural consolidation across the state over the past several decades? What are the factors that do allow some farms to persist? What were the conditions that enabled families to inhabit that land in the first place? So those are a couple that stand out. Thinking about my notes here, if there's any others to highlight. Had a student who found family photos that reminded him strongly of American Gothic. So I'm really looking forward to seeing those, seeing how those play out. And yeah, those are a few snapshots. So I feel like that's kind of what I can report at this point. But really excited to see how this continues to play out. It'll be over the next couple of weeks, basically, that we work with those students on digitization and getting to visualize for me to get to visualize the things they've found. I'm actually doing this along with them. I've gone back to my home and looked through my old family photos, and I've got some great candidates for upload as well. I was fortunate to have a father who liked to take a lot of pictures, and not always just like pose shots. So, for instance, I got a picture of myself watching one of Iowa City's high schools being demolished. So that's going to be a cool addition to the collection. So that's where we are right now. And like I said, really excited to see where this goes. Hopefully I might be able to be back here in a year or two and share a lot of new exciting things that we've done between now and then. So thanks for your attention, and looking forward to the conversation.
All right, I think we're going to be moving on to some questions and